Hi everybody, welcome back to English 247. This is for our class for Tuesday the 31st. And if you will remember, I gave you a class as a reading day last week so that you could get a head start on the readings. And you'll see that in our notes below, I've indicated that what I'm going to be doing is posting each previous week in the folder entitled past class sessions so that you can review each of the weeks at your leisure, but the current week will be the week that will be easily accessible on Moodle. So that would be this week for us. And we had, during our first class, reviewed the syllabus. And I had skipped the section on plagiarism. I'm sure it's probably something that you've discussed in other English classes before, when you're using somebody else's language or ideas and you're not giving them credit. And the key is giving credit. Once you do that, you are performing research. But if you don't give credit, then it makes it appear, whether deliberate or not, that the information that you are giving to the audience is your original work. And that is called basically the theft of intellectual property. It would be very similar to stealing a product, let's say, in a store. The difference is that you are taking somebody else's original idea or original language and making it seem as if it's your work. It's a pretty significant issue in academia. If you were to be caught, you could, if you got off easily, flunk the assignment, but if you didn't get off easily, you could actually be expelled with a notation on your transcript that the reason why you were expelled was because of plagiarism. So it's a pretty serious offense. And I always leave my students with two stories to encourage them not to plagiarize. The first actually happened to me very early on in my career. This would be pre-internet dates, so I couldn't go to the internet to do an internet search. And as many resources as exist on the internet to help students plagiarize, there are an equal number of sources on the internet to help professors determine if students are plagiarizing. So, for instance, one of my favorites is called turnitin.com, where I can actually do a search based on sentence or paragraph to see if I can find the original source. But I couldn't do that at that point. But I knew that what I was reading sounded familiar, and after a few minutes I was able to determine why. And the reason why is because it was from our very own class textbook, with a few mechanical errors here and there. I don't know if this meant that the person was just sloppy with their copying or whether they were trying to make it appear that it was their original work by having some errors embedded in there. The second story, the better story, occurred around the same time to a middle-aged professor, and that part's important. And he's reading a series of papers, and again, a paper seems familiar. Not that surprising, because ultimately professors are pretty well read, but he couldn't go to the internet to do a search. He had to rely on his memory as he's trying to think, where have I read this before? Where have I read this before? And then he realized he hadn't read it before. He had written it decades earlier as an undergraduate. It was one of his old papers. And it had something to do with a fraternity that was recycling papers from former members, but somehow, some way, this student actually got a hold of his own professor's work and submitted it in as his own. And not only did he get caught plagiarizing, but it was actually reported in academic newspapers. So, and there are such things as academic newspapers. So those are my two stories to encourage you not to plagiarize. Yes, it's possible not to be caught, but if you are caught, the consequences are significant. Kind of liken it to cheating on your taxes. But nevertheless, the kinds of writing assignments that we're going to do this semester, I don't think are the kinds of writing assignments that would even tempt someone to plagiarize. If you remember, we had talked about journals, and that at the ending of each of the major works we'll be reading this semester, you will be writing an informal response, approximately a page or so, but as long or as short as you'd like it to be. And I will evaluate it based on content, not on grammar or mechanics. I call these journals, and it's a way for us to interact or have a kind of conversation on paper. And I grade them informally on a checkmark system. And then, yes, you do have a formal academic paper approximately midway through the semester. It'll be a critical paper. In other words, I'm not asking you to do outside research. That said, if you really did want to do outside research, it's something we could negotiate. But one of my goals in this class is to make sure that we all have skills in reading on our own, so that when we are reading works from this period or other periods, we don't necessarily have to rely on outside interpretation in order to make sense of the works. And you all have the option of revising that first paper for a higher grade if you so elect. And the second paper would be due at the ending of the semester, also a critical paper. And if you submitted it in at the very ending of the semester, obviously there wouldn't be enough time to revise it. But there is a possibility you could revise the second paper if you submitted it in early enough. So that just leaves the final examination, which is open book, open notes, and it's an essay exam in which you can basically synthesize some of the major points that we've been talking about over the course of this semester. So basically, I'll talk about suggested paper topics as the semester progresses, but you can certainly come up with your own paper topics as well, so that's something you can think about as you are beginning the readings. And I had started the readings by asking you to read an essay entitled The Cult of True Womanhood, and I included a link for that. And it basically is some scholarship that was done on women's magazines from the 1800s. I think I might have shared with you that I also teach media and popular culture. So I think media and popular culture is a wonderful way to get a lens into the reality of a civilization. And certainly we see that in a society. And certainly we see that in the cult of true womanhood through the evaluation of women's magazines. And I wanted to use that as a foundation for us to get a sense of the historical perspective of the 1800s for female before we actually get into the readings themselves. And I had indicated that our first major reading is going to be Frankenstein. And while we have multiple classes devoted to Frankenstein, my hope is that you are in the midst of reading Frankenstein now, so that when our first Frankenstein class begins, you would have read it in its entirety. Though I know that may not necessarily have been possible, but read as much as you can, so that ultimately by the time we get to our second major work, which happens to be Persuasion, the idea is that you would have completed Persuasion in its entirety, or at least as much as possible, so that while we're reading Persuasion, you can anticipate the next work, because this is a summer session, so it is condensed. But at today's class, I wanted to start with a short story and talk a little bit about how that not only illustrates the role of female during the 1800s, but also we could use it as an example of how to go about critically reading a text, as we will be doing throughout the course of the semester. And that first journal won't be due until approximately the 7th of June, and that would be on Frankenstein itself. So this is just introductory material. As far as I'm concerned, we start to get into the actual heart of the class itself next class when we start talking about Frankenstein. But going back to the cult of true womanhood, it talked about 4 attributes that were essential for female during this time period. Piety, which would be religion. Purity, which would be virginity. Domesticity, which would be homemaking. And finally, submissiveness, which would be passivity. And I wanted to highlight a few important quotes from that particular essay. And keep in mind that the texts we're going to be reading this semester, in one way or another, are in direct contrast to this idea. But this piece begins, and it was written in 1966, an investigation of how female was viewed from approximately 1820 to 1860, that the woman was a hostage, basically, to the home and to the ideals of homemaking. That was what was considered to be ideal for female during the time period, what they called true womanhood. And that the source of a woman's strength was ultimately in her religion, and that ultimately her role was to be a better Eve, one that would not corrupt male, but would save male from corruption. And also that religion could work as a kind of pacifier, and or a tranquilizer, and many of these elements worked in, or many of these virtues worked in that fashion. And that religion would offer female dignity in her dependence. And women's seminaries at the time emphasized this idea of religion, including Mount Holyoke, which is a neighbor of ours. It promised their catalog to make female education a handmaid to the gospel. And we'll talk a little bit more about Mount Holyoke when we talk about female authors like Emily Dickinson. Purity was also essential, and that a woman tended to fall into one of two categories: Madonna, which was incredibly virginal and holy and pious, or whore. And that would basically be the fallen woman, that a woman would basically seem to not have worth if she didn't have her virginity until marriage. It's something that we see all the way back in Shakespeare's times. A play like A Midsummer Night's Dream, for instance, where the character Hermia is so careful to tell Lysander, her suitor, to lie further off because she doesn't want them to be tempted to engage in sex prior to marriage, as they are running away to elope in the forest. Some practical advice: sit not with another in a place that is too narrow. Read not out of the same book. Let not your eagerness to see anything induce you to place your head close to another person. This is from the Young Lady's Friend, advice for young females at the time. Note, too, that madness was oftentimes associated with loss of virtue, and that's something that we will also talk about as the text progress over the course of this semester. If a woman could withstand a man's assaults on her, she demonstrated her superiority and her power. And it really wasn't that long ago, in the 1980s, when a Prince Charles was marrying a Lady Diana. Before she could become Princess Diana, she had to visit the royal gynecologist in order to prove her virginity, that her hymen was still intact. Of course, if you know anything about science and biology, you know that's not the way to prove virginity. Nevertheless, that was something that actually occurred just a few decades ago. So, the idea of a woman's role to save a man from himself is something that we will also see throughout the course of the semester in some of the texts, and also the idea of female authors questioning this idea in some of the texts. The third virtue was submission, and there was a certain level of paradox here, that a woman needed to be innocent until she was married, but of course marriage meant that the innocence was lost, and marriage was the ideal, and that submission would occur to the husband in the way that submission would occur to the father figure. A woman's power would come through children, and that's where she could exert her sense of authority and control. So there was the idea too that a woman would receive her reward not through power, but through affection and love, through familial relationships. And again, talking about Shakespeare, there was this idea of the great chain of being, that everything had hierarchy in the universe, and God would be at the top because he was the ultimate creator. The angels would even be ranked based on their abilities and powers, and then humans would be ranked, and then animals would be ranked, and man was ranked above female. Male was ranked above female because of his ability to reason. So you can see that this is an old idea that females should be submissive and should live a kind of perpetual childhood and dependence, and should show reverence to the husband's wishes even when she didn't necessarily agree with his opinion. That a wife should, this is a quote, occupy herself with only domestic affairs and wait till the husband confides in her those of high importance, and not to give advice until asked for. And that a woman's lot was basically based on fortune or fate. So the last piece of how a woman's virtue would be, or a woman's worth would be viewed, would be through domesticity. The idea that she was the homemaker. Even think about the term housewife, about being married to the house, in effect. The home should be a cheerful place and a safe place. particularly for the males in the household. The woman's most important function outside of comforter and outside of maintainer of household would be as a nurse. And ironically, this is some of the ways that she could exert power. That ultimately her ability to provide health and safety and welfare within the house gave her a certain level of power. And that housework thus was morally uplifting, and the repetition associated with housework again could be seen as a kind of tranquilizer, or it could be shown as a way to illustrate the virtues of patience. Possible hobbies for a woman: she could write letters, she could sing, she could play an instrument, she might even read. But the female, and this is a quote, was dangerously addicted to novels, according to the literature of the period. She should avoid them since they interfered with serious piety. She simply couldn't help herself and read them anyway. She should choose edifying ones of morally acceptable authors. She should study history since it showed the depravity of the human heart and the evil nature of sin. And on the whole, religious biography was best. And that it was known that a girl could be ruined by a book. The seduction stories regarding exciting and dangerous books as contributory causes of disaster. That the man without honorable attentions always provides the innocent maiden with such books as a prelude to his assault on her virtue. Books which attacked or seemed to attack women's accepted place in society were regarded as equally dangerous. And one reviewer said that these sorts of books should be kept out of the hands of American women because they were so susceptible to persuasion. And I emphasize the word persuasion. Keep that in mind when we read the text Persuasion after Frankenstein. With their gentle, yielding natures, that they might listen to the bold ravings of the hard-featured of their own sex. The frightening result: such reading will unsettle them for their true station and pursuits and will throw the world back again into confusion. There was also a great fear at the time of women not following these four ideals, becoming educated and literary. They were known as blue stockings. They oftentimes advocated for dress reform, since dress was a way, attire was a way to basically take away the power of female. Just the multiple layers of clothing that female had to wear ultimately restricted movement. Corsets, for instance, are a wonderful example where sometimes they were bound so tightly that ribs could actually be broken. And I do remember as recently as 9/11, when individuals were fleeing from the World Trade Center, that the women in business attire were at a disadvantage as compared to the men in business attire because of the skirts the women were oftentimes wearing, but more importantly, the high-heeled shoes. Not that any kind of dress shoe was meant to be athletic wear, but on that day, those who were not wearing high heels were certainly at an advantage in terms of fleeing. That education benefited the males in the family, but not necessarily the females. And the female seminaries were basically devoted to creating female to understand her role in true womanhood. Mount Holyoke, again, paid pious tribute to domestic skills. They said in their catalog, young lady despised this branch of the duties of woman, and she despises the appointments of her existence. God, nature, and the Bible were basically her main duties. So that, was ultimately the context of the women who were rebelling against the time period. Keep in mind this was the time of the Civil War. Keep in mind that this was the time period of the Industrial Revolution. Keep in mind that this was the time period of dress reform as well. And even though the role of female was seen to raise good Christians and good patriots, there was a pushback to that as well. And that's what we will see in some of the texts that we will be reading this semester. Even something like Frankenstein, which is a very male-centric text that we'll be talking about over the course of our investigation with Frankenstein. So this was a very different world for female. Keep in mind that a female had no legal rights in marriage. She could not vote. She could not own property. She could not divorce. This gives us a sense of what Mrs. Mallard might have experienced in the story of an hour. So I'm moving forward to the short story that I had assigned for us today by Kate Chopin, a very important author during this time period. And we will end the semester with her novella, The Awakening, which I believe I mentioned had led to her basically being blacklisted because it was considered so scandalous at the time. But even something like Story of an Hour could be considered scandalous based on what I've just reviewed in The Cult of True Womanhood. And what we are given, and again, I had given you a link where you could access this short story, is just the story of literally an hour, a life-changing hour, with the Mrs. Mallard, who basically is told, the plot is quite simple, that her husband has died in an accident. And she goes off to mourn, and she moves from being distraught to being relieved and even excited. And perhaps we can understand her feelings when we think about the kind of repression and suppression that all female would have experienced during this time period. At the ending of the story, we find out that it was a terrible mistake, that her husband had not been in an accident after all, and he arrives home unscathed, and she dies of a heart attack. We are told at the beginning of the story that she has heart problems, and we're told at the ending of the story that she died of joy that kills. A little bit of irony. And a couple of things that I wanted to mention to you about this particular story is the reference to her name, Mrs. Mallard. Note that we don't get her first name until later in the story when she believes that she's a widow. The idea that she's lost her individual identity and that she takes on the husband's name. Even the term Mrs. is a way to determine whether female is married or unmarried with the term of Miss, which is why Ms., which is relatively new, was created, because the term Mr. doesn't necessarily denote marital status. Mallard is a bird, particularly it is a duck, very common duck. And I oftentimes, when I do this story in my introduction to literature class, I have students look up elements associated with mallards. So for instance, the males are quite colorful and the females are rather bland, and that might be something that could be a metaphor for the role of female during this time period, that the male would have power and would have the interest of society, not female. Also, mallards would mate for life, but then ultimately the male would go off and then leave the female, and that perhaps could be something that could perhaps be applicable to role of female as well, especially in this particular story where ultimately the husband leaves Mrs. Mallard, not of his own accord. This is through death, of course. And we're told that Mrs. Mallard has heart trouble at the beginning. So the suggestion isn't not just heart disease. This is not just physiological, but heart trouble. This is emotional, since the heart is oftentimes the seat of what we think of in terms of emotion and love. And her sister Josephine, and notice how Josephine is given a first name while Mrs. Mallard is not. Eventually, we learn Mrs. Mallard's first name, which is Louise. Both Louise and Josephine have male roots to them. Again, sort of emphasizing the idea that this is a male-centric society. That Brentley Mallard, notice the husband gets a first name initially, has died in a terrible accident. And she goes off to be by herself, which would have been considered unusual for female, something that we'll talk about next class. It was expected that a female should usually be accompanied by someone or someone's. And she goes into a room. There's a good amount of symbolism here where she faces an open window. A window is a way to see outside. Think about, again, the home as serving as a kind of imprisonment for female. And the idea that the window is open, the idea that now that she is a widow, she can experience a certain sense of freedom. And again, at the time period, widowhood was pretty much the only way that a woman could experience freedom. in the sense that if she was the heir to the husband's property, then she would not have financial reasons to remarry. Perhaps that was one of the reasons why the remarriage rate for female widows was much lower than the remarriage rate for male widowers, who basically perhaps were looking for piety, purity, domesticity, and submissiveness, as the cult of true womanhood had suggested. And at first she wept at once, but then she goes into a comfortable, roomy armchair. Think about the idea of an armchair. It's made for one individual, not for two. And this idea that it's roomy and comfortable. And she's looking at an open square outside. So there are all of these images of freedom and openness. She's looking at the top of trees and new spring life. The seasons oftentimes are used as examples for different stages in life, where spring could be renewal or rebirth, summer could be height of life, fall could be the beginning of descent, and winter could be the descent. She's watching sparrows. Kate Chopin loves to use bird imagery, the idea that a bird can be trapped in a cage, but that a bird can also be set free and fly off. We'll see this in The Awakening. There were patches of blue sky here and there. There was rain, and rain is usually viewed as a somewhat negative, darkness and depression. But rain and water can also be cleansing and can lead to new life and rebirth. And the idea that blue skies are coming forth is that this is the beginning of something that's positive. And when we're told about the direction of the window, in the west facing the window, you could think about all of the associations with the west, whether it is westward expansion and new opportunities. The sun sets at the west, in the west, so this could be the ending of one kind of life for Mrs. Mallard or Louise, and the idea is that the sun will rise the next day in the east, and this could be a new beginning for her. So basically what I'm doing is I'm going through the text and I'm trying to identify those elements within the text that could have additional meaning outside of the literal, which is what we usually do when we read literature. Now, obviously, this is a short story, so we're going to be doing this in a much more precise way than we would with a novel that's multiple. That could be multiple pages of description. So ultimately, we won't necessarily be able to do as close of a reading, perhaps, when you've got a novel that's several hundred pages long rather than just several paragraphs long. But the idea is that a literary author is doing more than just telling a story. They're usually trying to make a statement as well. And they're usually trying to use language that can have multiplicity of meaning and symbolism associated with it. And she was young with a calm, fair face, but it bespoke repression. And it makes sense that she would feel repressed after reviewing what we did with the cult of true womanhood. And she's waiting for something fearfully. So this is not something necessarily that she's looking forward to. She doesn't even know what it is. She can't name it. And her bosom is rising and falling tumultuously, which has perhaps some sexual association with it. And this might mean also her freedom sexually, as well as her freedom economically and also physically from marriage now that she's a widow. And she says, free, free, free. In other words, she begins to feel and understand that she's free. And she didn't stop to ask if this were a monstrous joy that held her. A clear and exalted perception enabled her to suggest or enabled her to dismiss the suggestion as trivial. It's not about judgment. Of course, we might judge Mrs. Mallard. We might understand and empathize, sympathize with her situation. We might perhaps not, and think of it as horrible that she would be so pleased over the death of her husband. But this isn't about judgment. The initial reading is trying to determine the character and the character's response and what the author's reason is for presenting us with this character. Then we can decide how we feel about the character. And she knew she'd weep when she saw the kind, tender hands folded in death. So there isn't anything to suggest that Bentley mistreated her in any way. In fact, quite the opposite, since he was kind and tender. But this goes beyond the specific person in marriage and more about the institution of marriage and the role of female during the time period. And she admits he never looked safe with love upon her. But she saw beyond that to a long procession of years to come that would belong to her, absolutely. And she opened and spread her arms out to them in welcome. There would be no one to live for her during those coming years. She would live for herself. Or there would be no one to live, yes, there would be no one to live for her during those coming years. She would live for herself. There would be no powerful will bending hers in that blind persistence with which men and women believe they have a right to impose a private will upon a fellow creature. This is perhaps my favorite quote in the story because this suggests it's not just about female feeling entrapped in marriage, but this is both about male and female feeling entrapped in marriage, that is what the institution of marriage does. And notice that we're presented with only one kind of marriage, and that's because of the time period, and that is the heterosexual marriage. And she admits she loved him sometimes, because love can be a complicated emotion. Often she had not, and what did it matter? Again, this isn't about judgment. She feels free, free, free. Her sister says, Louise, we get her first name, open the door. She's thinking about spring days and summer days that will belong to her. Again, times of the of seasons that are associated with positive elements. And then she goes downstairs with her sister like a goddess of victory, and then walks in Brentley Mallard, holding his grip sack and umbrella. I love the term grip sack rather than suitcase or valise. And I think the reason why I like the term grip sack is because this idea of gripping and holding on to something as if it's a possession, which is how female would have been viewed at the time period, rather than briefcase, let's say, or suitcase or valise or something of that nature. And an umbrella. You can even say that he's bringing the rain in or the bad weather inside when he announces he was far from the scene of the accident. They didn't even know there'd been one. And while they try to shield Mrs. Mallard, because we've already been told that she has heart trouble, it was too late. When the doctors came, they said she had died of heart disease. And of course, the doctors and everyone assumes that this is a physical ailment of joy that kills, that she was so overjoyed that her husband was alive that the shock killed her. And yes, she had loved him, so she might have felt joy, but she probably also felt disappointment and dismay, and that she was losing some of her newfound freedom. But of course, we're privy to information that they aren't, because we were with Mrs. Mallard when she was alone in that room. And in the text that I used for my introduction to literature class, they asked some questions about this story that I wanted you to consider. The text asks, do you find Mrs. Mallard a sympathetic character? Some readers think she's callous, selfish, unnatural, even monstrous, because she revels in her newly discovered sense of freedom so soon after learning of her husband's death. Others see her as a victim of her inability to control her own life in a repressive, male-dominated society. Is it possible to hold both views simultaneously? Are your views influenced by your being male or female? Does your age reflect your perception or your social and economic status? How about your nationality, race, or religion? Does that shape your attitudes? Do you have particular views about the institution of marriage that inform your assessment of Mrs. Mallard's character? And have other reading experiences, perhaps a familiarity with some of Chopin's other works, predisposed you one way or another to Mrs. Mallard? And I like to ask these questions to show you how literature is indeed subjective and that there are many elements that go into interpretation. But that said, what you need to do is to find evidence within the text in order to be able to support your particular interpretation. I admit that we all have bias. I've always suspected that if I did this story with two cohorts, one of newly married individuals and one with newly divorced individuals, that the class responses would probably be radically different. And I think both could be valid depending on the pieces of evidence that those cohorts decided to focus on, whether it be that she did love him or whether it be that now she could be free. So again, we all have bias, and one of the great things I believe about literature is that it has multiple interpretations. It's not as clear-cut as 2 + 2 = 4. which some people love because of the possibility of interpretation. Some people hate because they just want the answer. And if you've ever been in an English class, you know how English teachers can oftentimes respond in very stubborn or in very frustrating ways when a student stubbornly asks, well, what's the answer? And an English teacher might say, well, there are multiple possibilities here. And there will be multiple possibilities in analyzing all of these texts. But again, our role is almost like a court attorney to gather the pieces of evidence that would support our particular position, and noting that it's quite possible to have two opposing positions in the same text that are in direct contrast with one another, and both can be equally valid depending on the evidence in which we focus. So I just wanted to begin this semester again by talking a little bit about the time period, which I will revisit next class as well, and also to give you a short story and talk a little bit about reading techniques. So next class we begin with Frankenstein, and we've got multiple classes devoted to Frankenstein. And do note that the texts get easier as the semester progresses. The texts are put in chronological order. I think that's one of the reasons why as well. So if you're struggling a bit with Frankenstein, don't despair. As I indicated, by the time we get to the ending of the semester, I think you'll find the texts will have increased in their accessibility. And for today's attendance question, because you'll remember that I am basically going to give you a discussion question in your discussion form, and that your response serves as attendance. So thank you very much for answering the last attendance question, which is basically introducing yourself to the class. And you aren't required to respond to other classmates, though I certainly encourage you to. But you will have noticed that I responded to all of your responses. What I do ask is that you read all of your classmates' responses and all of my responses, at the very least, just to give you an idea of the kind of discussion that we would have had in class. But today's attendance question, which will be due Thursday because you've got a 48-hour period, that would be the 2nd of June at 9 a.m. And of course, if you need additional time, just ask me for an extension. I'll be happy to grant it to you. The attendance question is about the story of an hour. Did you like or dislike Chopin's ending of Joy That Kills in the story of an hour, and why? Notice that there is no right or wrong answer to this particular question. Those are the questions I like to ask, questions that require debate and thought, really. So I hope you're all doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on next class talking about Frankenstein. Take care. Bye-bye.